Convene, I guess. Anyway, Fred, you want to start the naming of? I used to be.
President, Fred Gallagher, president, is that what we're going for? Okay.
Your name and, the
Yes.
president, whatever it is. Okay.
Rick Pennell, present.
Tish Gallagher.
Sandra Taylor.
Alice Real.
Gail Sight.
As I mentioned, Mike Marinelli will not be here tonight. He's not feeling well. So we're all here, I guess. Did everybody have a chance to take a look at the minutes from the last meeting? I didn't see any changes that were necessary. Kathy does an unbelievable job, especially
Yeah.
considering that she had a coughing fit the last month. we were doing
I
it.
might have another one tonight.
Oh, really? Oh, no, oh, no.
I have one,
Okay.
I mean, maybe it's a question, since our building inspector is here. In the minutes, it says the city administrator is the floodplain manager. Is that true, Jeff, or is it you?
The city administrator is nominally named the floodplain administrator, and the clause in there says he can delegate it to any person he wants, or or any firm that he wants, or any, there's something, three things you can delegate it for, because that's not his area of expertise.
Yes.
So he delegated it to me, and then
So is it correct to say the city administrator is the floodplain manager? Or
and
should
his
we say?
designee for the whatever time I have left is me.
Yeah, he is the official floodplain manager. I think there has to be official named of one, right, for various.
No, they just did it because they thought I was, no. It's so that you could switch firms if you, like, Delaware City has Dave Athey, who's really part of AECom, and they might switch to KCI for their consultant, and then it'd be something, they want to make it be some.
You mean rather than hire, take David Athey as your floodplain manager?
They hire
Yeah,
Dave
somebody who's
Athey
not
as
part of the government.
as the firm, and we could do that here, or
Yeah.
or whatever. They just did that for flexibility and.
All right, so I guess for the minutes, the city administrator is the floodplain manager or it doesn't matter.
It
Okay,
really, I have no ego, but
you're
I'm the one that
You're
gets in
it.
trouble if we screw up, yeah.
right.
For purposes of the minutes, you would title them.
Okay.
Okay, anybody else have any questions about the minutes? Okay, so we want to approve minutes. All those in favor, say aye. Okay, they're approved. I wanted to talk for a moment about the thing that is making us tread water right now, their request to the NRCS. I texted Ann Baldwin, who's our contact there today, and she wrote back to me that, I'll quote her, she said, we have not received the funding yet in the state for the PIFR. Now, the PIFR is the initial inquiry, that they go through to find out if we're eligible. I have reached out to ask when we can expect to receive the funding, and will let you know as soon as I get an answer. As soon as the funds are received, I will begin the process to secure the contractor and will bring you and the administrator into the process. So this sounds like it's pretty much a done deal. Maybe it's just the preliminary inquiry is a done deal, but at least we get that, that in process probably very quickly. So she's gonna let me know as soon as she knows that she's everything. So does anybody have anything to report about what they volunteered for, the town meetings or the changes in the food or anything like that? No? Are we working on that, or are we waiting for something else, or what? Are we?
To review the code, is that what you're asking?
Well, remember at a meeting a couple meetings ago, I said, does anybody want to take the volunteer for, looking at code changes and also making a presentation to and also doing the outreach to Tish and I are going to be doing that, but we haven't done anything because Tish was on vacation and I was on vacation, so we're going to get together soon, right, Tish, for that. But has any,
We have not.
is there a better way to do it then? Is it difficult for you guys to do it? Should we be doing it as a general? or-
No, I think I think you would need it would be more efficient to do it.
That's a group, I mean,
No, in a smaller, and then bring it back to the group.
Right.
But we have to meet with Mr. Bergstrom,
Okay.
to do that. And I mean, Tommy or I can set up a meeting. We haven't done that yet.
Come on down.
Okay, so just get in touch with you and,
Tomorrow morning's good.
all right,
Were we supposed to do something? Yeah, it was like the presentation.
The
type
communities?
thing For the communities,
Yeah.
and I was kind of waiting, to try to get some more information.
Sure, I mean, you know, it's just, I want to make sure that this is the best way to do it, that it's not putting too much of a burden on people or anything like that.
No, I
Okay.
think, I think small groups.
Okay,
Like Gail said,
We can't have three, though,
Or
because-
better, or.
no, that would be against FOIA. There can only be two people that can work on each thing, right? I realized that today when I was thinking about it.
So I'll get in touch with you and Jeff. and we'll see if we
Yeah. Okay, public comments on agenda items only. Does anybody have any comments on agenda items that are coming up? It's mainly, Ms. Johnson is going to be talking about the effects of storm surge. No? Rick, you want to take over here?
I'd like to introduce Sarah Johnson. She is from the NOAA Weather,
National Weather Service.
National Weather Service, thank you. And up in Mount Holly, and I'm sure everyone is familiar with Mount Holly because that's where all our local forecasts originate. And I contacted her and I asked her if she would speak to storm surge specifically, and I think she's also going to bring up tidal flooding as well. Anything else I left out? Really appreciate her coming tonight on this stormy night. Okay, so Sarah, please go ahead.
Thank you all. Yes, and I apologize now for the weather that's out here. Not that I have any control over it. I just forecast it, but I'm gonna put this up here. So I can access it. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about both the combination of storm surge, tidal flooding, whether it comes from tropical or non-tropical sources. The impacts are the same. So we're going to be kind of going over both, kind of doing a comprehensive overview. As mentioned, I work in the Mount Holly office. So our office covers all of Delaware, 4 counties in Maryland, as well as much of New Jersey and portions of southeastern Pennsylvania. So yes, I heard somebody mentioning the snow. 4 of the counties that we cover are under winter weather advisory up in our northwest. So you can see the variety that we cover.
Oh, God.
Okay, let's see. Just a second here. We have to go.
It's all right. Gosh, it looks like it should work, right?
Should.
Ah,
There we
there
go.
Great.
Okay. All right. I think I just lost connection there for a second. Okay. So first, before I get too deep into differences between tropical and non-tropical, we have to bring up one topic, and that is the difference between a whole bunch of terminology that is used when we're talking about storm surge and tidal flooding, coastal flooding. So officially, when we talk about storm surge, the official definition is the height of the water over and above what the astronomical tide is. So the astronomical tide is just what the tide would be just based on the phase of the moon. no weather intervention at all. And then the storm surge is that amount of water above that. And then there's another title called storm tide, and that is the storm surge plus the astronomical tide. So basically your total water level. And sometimes we do call it the total water level. In this example here, you have 15-foot storm surge. The high tide normally on that day would be 2 feet. So 2 plus 15 would be a 17-foot storm tide. When we get into though talking about both tropical and non-tropical tidal flooding, saltwater flooding, usually when we're talking about that, we just are referring to the total tide level. We're not asking you all to add the tide level plus whatever we're forecasting. We're just forecasting the total tide level in most cases. So what is the components to the storm surge? Whether we're talking about non-tropical or tropical, the biggest component unquestionably is the wind. So in this case, this is a tropical example. And you can see this kind of wave that is described here. This would be the total storm surge. One of the misconceptions is that the pressure level in the tropical system has a lot to do with the storm surge. It has a small bit, but as you can see in here, it's generally a very, very small percentage. In this case, about 5% of the total storm surge. The rest of it is a wind-driven storm surge. And so that is why the area that is right of the track of the storm in tropical cases, we'll talk about this more in a minute, is at the highest risk for the storm surge. And by the way, if we have any questions as I'm going through, just let me know. So what kind of watches, warnings, and advisories would be issued if we are expecting tidal flooding? In the case of tropical, we would issue a storm surge watch or a storm surge warning, depending how far out we are. Conveniently, as I was putting this presentation together, unfortunately, we had a tropical system. This was when Nicole was approaching Florida last week. And there was a storm surge warning out for much of Florida. When we're talking about and I'll point out here, you can see the storm surge warning in this case is only for a very small portion, basically right along the coast there. When we're talking about non-tropical tidal flooding, that is covered by either a coastal flood advisory, coastal flood watch, or coastal flood warning. The system we use to issue those aren't quite as sophisticated as what we do to do tropical. So it will be issued for an entire, what we call forecast zone, which in the case of Newcastle County is the entire county. So with the coastal flood advisories, coastal flood warnings and stuff is issued for the entire county.
Can I ask, what is non-tropical? Is it tropical a hurricane and non-tropical everything else? Or-
Correct. Tropical is a hurricane or tropical storm. Non-tropical is nor'easters, anything that does not have a tropical in origin. We'll talk about some exceptions. You can have a tropical system that goes through the post-tropical transition, which may still be covered by tropical products. We can talk about more about that, but yeah, in general, when I say non-tropical, I'm just talking about any tidal flooding that isn't covered by hurricanes, tropical storms, and related.
So Superstorm Sandy, when it hit us,
So that is the exception. So when Superstorm Sandy hit us back 10 years ago in 2012, we had a rule in place in the National Weather Service that when a system went through the post-tropical transition, that we would discontinue any tropical products and just cover it with non-tropical products. Well, in the we do these big reviews after every major event that we have, and we discovered that caused a lot of confusion. At that time, we didn't even have storm surge watches and warnings. This is something that came about because, in no small part, because of Sandy. But we also discovered that caused a lot of confusion. We didn't have a hurricane warning up, for example, for the New Jersey coast. So if that was to happen, heaven forbid, but if that was to happen again, that would be covered by tropical products now, because it was close enough to the tropical transition that it would just make it more simple to cover it with tropical
Less
products.
confusing.
So, so when we're talking about tropical and non-tropical, in addition to differences in the names of the watches and warnings, there's another difference. And that is when we're talking about tropical, generally when we're talking about our forecast for the storm surge with tropical systems, we're giving a, what we call a reasonable worst case scenario, which means the forecast that you're seeing is 90% of the time is going to be at or below that level. So it's not the most likely forecast, which is what we do when we're doing non-tropical forecasts. That is the most likely forecast. So if those of you into probabilities, when we're talking about non-tropical forecasts for coastal flooding, we're talking about the 50th percentile. When we're talking about tropical, we're talking about the 90th percentile for exceedance. And why is there this difference? Well, when we're talking about tropical, we're going to go over this in just a minute, you have a very large difference over a very short span of what can cause flooding and what can cause an offshore flow. And just a small shift in that can make a big difference. So we want to emphasize, because a lot of times tropicals, there's also concern about evacuations and stuff like that. So we want to give a kind of buffer to emergency managers and decision makers as to what they could feasibly expect if the forecast is off even by just a little bit. Whereas non-tropical happens on a much larger scale. Generally, you're not seeing those really drastic changes in wind direction over a short distance. And so that makes all the difference in the world. And that's why we do a most likely forecast for non-tropical. So speaking of tropical, so my next couple slides are just focused on tropical storm surge and tropical tidal flooding. So why does the track of the system make such a difference? Remember, we were talking a couple slides ago about how the wind has the biggest impact on the storm surge, not the pressure. That means that in the Northern Hemisphere, I should have opened with that caveat. All I'm talking about here is the Northern Hemisphere. I'm not qualified to talk about meteorology in the Southern Hemisphere, but in the Northern Hemisphere, winds go counterclockwise around the center of a low of a tropical system. So I said that the area on the right side of the forward movement of the tropical system is the most at risk for coastal flooding. And the reason for that is on the right side of the forward movement is going to be where you have the onshore flow. And when you have winds going onshore, that is going to pile up the water towards the shore, and that's what leads to storm surge. When you have the opposite, you have the winds blowing offshore, that helps the water evacuate further from the coast. And so that generally tends to lead to lower water levels. So in this case, if this was headed north, the area to the right of the forward movement, so to the east, all these winds would be going, if you can imagine, here's the coastline, all these winds would be going right on shore. If this was headed west, like for example, here I kind of driven a arrow similar to the path that Sandy took. So the forward movement is to the west. Therefore, the area that has the most at risk is to the north of that. It's to the right of the forward movement. That's where all the onshore is. And then on this side, we have winds blowing offshore. So again, I mentioned this is kind of similar to what the path that Sandy took. And for those of you that were here 10 years ago, you know that the New York Battery and Sandy Hook area really got a lot of the storm surge. Whereas as you went lower, there was still some storm surge. We'll talk more about that in just a second, but it wasn't nearly to the level that we saw on the northern New Jersey shore. Now, the reason there was still some storm surge here in Delaware and in South Jersey is that it's very rare that you're going to have a tropical system develop at this latitude and just move due west. as was the case with Sandy, came up and then moved that way. So we still have some of the water starting to pile up as it was moving north before it made that western turn. So we talked a little bit about, kind of the path that Sandy took and what that might affect, but I also want to bring up, a couple other storm tracks that may be a concern for this portion of Delaware. So if we have a system that goes a little bit further south than Sandy, but still moving to the west, you can imagine there, if the center of the low goes south of the opening of the Delaware Bay, that causes the waters just to start piling up within the Delaware Bay. And that makes it very difficult for water to evacuate out of the Delaware Bay, which has implications as you go further up here to Newcastle and even going further up into tidal portions of the Delaware River. Similarly, if we have a storm that kind of comes up the Chesapeake Bay, and that will put, depending on how large the wind swath is of the storm, which we'll talk more about in a minute, that will also lead the Delaware Bay in this area into the onshore flow. And even if it's going on an inland track, again, depending on how large the wind field is, you'll still see the water, you can still see the water piling up in the Delaware Bay. Now, the one thing about this is usually when the center of the low is traveling over land, it tends to weaken. So we tend to see weakening wind fields when it takes that path. But yeah, any of these three could be potentially quite challenging. And this one could be too, depending on where it originates from and how it goes, but would be better for areas south of the low versus areas north of it. Any questions about the track of tropical storms? Yeah.
Doesn't the structure of Delaware Bay in that it's kind of like a big funnel have a increasing effect as we come farther north?
Yes, so it does. In fact, we're going to show another example of bays in general have that issue of when you get water start piling up in there, it makes it harder to evacuate because it's not necessarily open to the ocean. Now, Delaware Bay is at least in a little bit better position because it is somewhat open to the ocean. If you compare that to the Chesapeake Bay and the opening, Chesapeake Bay goes all the way up here, and that can be a big challenge. Whereas this is a little bit more open. And I'm gonna show example too of Lake Charles down in Louisiana, where it just has one little inlet. In general, the fewer inlets that you have open to the ocean and the narrower those inlets are, the more of a magnifying effect it can have. So yes, bays in general are challenges when we talk about tidal flooding and water piling up. But at least the Delaware Bay is a little more open than some bays. Other questions about the direction of tropical systems? Okay, so speaking of the bays, so this was Hurricane Laura, which actually happened back in 2020. And this was the track that it actually ended up taking. And this is Lake Charles, Louisiana. And we can model about the storm surge that occurs with a system, given its track and given its strength. And so this is, I didn't see any verification statistics if this is what really happened. I'd have to go back and look at that, but this is what was modeled with its general track. I know it's kind of hard to see, but there's one tiny little inlet here going into this bay. So the center of low was just a little bit to the east of that inlet. So unfortunately for this area, they got the brunt of the onshore flow and the storm surge, but it didn't really come up into the inlet. Now imagine if it had made just a 20-mile jog to the west, which is, in the scheme of tropical forecasting, when we get it within 20 miles of the track, we're doing pretty good. But if it had made just a 20-mile jog to the west, that would have meant it would have been to the west of the inlet. All of this water would have been coming straight into this inlet. And you can see the reds mean potentially greater than 9 feet above ground as far as water levels. So you can see what a difference it makes around this bay here. And again, that is an extreme case, and the Delaware Bay is a little more open than that. So is the track of the tropical system the only thing we have to worry about when we're talking about tropical storm surge? Well, the answer is no. There's a couple of other things that you have to worry about. First is the size of the storm and the extent of the wind field, the extent of the tropical storm force winds, the extent of the hurricane force winds. How far out from the center do those go? How many of you all were watching the news coverage of Hurricane Ian last month? Yeah. Did anybody see there was a little bit of a discussion? People were comparing it to Hurricane Charlie back in 2004. Because it took a similar path, at least when it came into Florida. This is Ian and this is Charlie. So it took a similar path to Charlie. But look at the difference in the wind field. This golden color is the extent of the tropical storm force winds. And the reddish colors, I know there's a difference, but they're both meant to represent the extent of the hurricane force winds. Look at the difference. In this case, aside from the far western Florida panhandle, you pretty much have the entire state of Florida in tropical storm force winds. Charlie was a very small storm and only affected a pretty narrow swath. Now, granted, it was still quite impactful, even in the swath, especially in the swath it covered, but the extent of the wind field didn't have quite as much of an impact. So that can have major impacts. In this case, when we're, talking about maybe Miami or somewhere here on southeastern Florida, you wouldn't expect to see quite as much in the way of storm surge because they're not really going to get the stronger tropical storm force winds. They're going to be outside of that swath. Whereas you can see in here, southeastern Florida is within the swath of tropical storm force winds, which has an impact on the storm surge. And also another thing that should be taken into account, and this is for tropical or non-tropical, is how long are those winds going to stay onshore? How long are they going to stay in that one direction? When we're talking about tropical systems, this means how fast is the storm moving forward, which is another difference between Charlie and Ian. Ian initially was a pretty slow storm, moving pretty slowly, whereas Charlie was moving not as fast as we would have liked, but it was still moving at a better clip. Non-tropical systems, like when we had the coastal low that actually was kind of the remnants of Ian, as it got up here, it kind of got incorporated into another system, and we had a new coastal low that it was not technically the same as Ian, a new coastal low that developed off our coast, and it just gave us onshore flow for like 3 days in a row. That duration had a big impact on not so much up here, but if you went down to Sussex County, they had quite a bit of coast tidal flooding with the non-tropical because of, not necessarily because of how strong the winds are, because they weren't too strong, but of just how long they continued on. So, also, another thing to keep in mind is what is your astronomical tide level? So if this storm surge, if you have a 2-foot storm surge that is hitting when you're at the quarter moon, so your high tide is maybe 3 feet below, your astronomical high tide is 3 feet below what would be considered minor flooding thresholds. Well, a 2-foot storm surge then isn't really going to cause issues. However, if that storm surge comes at the same time that you have a full moon or a new moon, and your astronomical tide is already only a 1/2 foot or a foot below what the minor flood threshold is, then, if it's only a 1/2 foot below what minor flood threshold is, which we do have a couple of those high tides every year, then you can sneeze and you can get coastal flooding. It doesn't take much more to get the tidal flooding. So what level the astronomical tides are when you're getting that storm surge has an impact on the degree of flooding that you could see. So since Sandy, like I said, there's been a lot of changes made to how we handle storm surge flooding with tropical systems. And now when we have a tropical system that is within 48 hours, we will produce inundation mapping. Again, this is tropical, so this would be describing what is the reasonable worst case scenario. This, by the way, is not a real system. This was just modeled afterwards just to show an example. This is, if you can't tell, this is Staten Island, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Jersey City, so New York City metro area. It will show in terms of color levels, the potential height above ground. So another thing we consider when we're talking about tidal flooding is what datum are we using? Are we talking about mean sea level, mean low or low water, or inundation, or height above ground level? And most of the time, we're going to be talking about height above ground level because that is the easiest to understand for most people. So in this case, yellows are 3 feet or greater above ground, orange 6 feet, 9, and red is 9 feet, and blue is 1 foot. So you can see what that would look like. Fortunately, knock on wood, we haven't had to have this since it has been implemented. Again, that has happened since Sandy. But this, if we ever had a system head our way, you would see this being produced within 48 hours of the potential event.
So can I ask you?
Yeah.
So that, the modeling is to warn people and start evacuations in those areas that are modeling, terrible storms, right?
Right. So this is what is, and you'll see when you pull it up on the National Hurricane Center webpage, you'll see a lot of disclaimers about, this is a reasonable worst case scenario. This is, supposed to be a decision aid for emergency managers. But yeah, it's really designed for emergency managers and other decision makers that have to make decisions about evacuations. What zones do we possibly need to evacuate?
So if the hurricane was coming right to Newcastle,
Mhm.
we'd be able to go online and see the modeling, right?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, even though it says it is designed specifically for emergency managers, it is available for everyone to see on the website. And it even does get, sometimes the Weather Channel will show it on their coverage too. But yeah, you have the access to it. When there's not an active storm, it's not on the website, so that's why I can't show it to you tonight. But yeah, it's available under the graphics for any storm. Any other questions about tropical before I take a jog into non-tropical for a minute? So non-tropical, this is again covering anything that is not covered by tropical storm surge. As I mentioned, we talk about the most likely scenario when we're talking about this, and we actually do tidal forecasts on a regular basis. We update it twice a day, every day. So this is an example from Atlantic City. My apologies, I gave this talk to somebody else, and I should have replaced this with Reedy Point, which is the nearest one for you all. But this is also relatively new. We've been doing this since about 2015. And we do it for 16 different tidal points in the area that we cover. So as I mentioned, Reedy Point is the closest one to you all. We also have one up at Philadelphia and one down in Kent County, as well as down into Lewis. So you can get an idea. Basically the green squares on this are everywhere we have a tidal forecast, which is great, but what happens in between all those 16 locations? Obviously, Reedy Point isn't right at Newcastle, so what would happen within this city if we're forecasting tidal flooding? Well, this year we have developed a new website, and don't stress about writing down this whole long URL. I know it's a lot. I'll show you how to get to it, and I'll also, when I share the presentation with you all, I'll share the exact URL so you can link to it. But this year, just actually within the last couple months, we have a inundation mapping that has come online, so you can visualize what moderate tidal flooding will look like in Newcastle. You can zoom down to Newcastle City, or what major tidal flooding would look like in Newcastle City. This is based on, there is another part of NOAA, which is kind of the umbrella organization that includes the National Weather Service as well as some other agencies. They created a sea level rise viewer that is available online. And so this work is kind of based off of that, that it kind of uses that same value. This is just filling in a gap until we have the capability, and the science catches up to the capability of being able to forecast tidal flooding on a more widespread scale instead of just 16 different sites. Does not provide depth. It will just show where areas could potentially be underwater, and it is not a forecast, but you can just see if we're forecasting minor flooding at Reedy Point, what would that potentially mean minor flooding at Newcastle? I'm going to skip this one. I'm going to go into it. So this one is talking about non-tropical. When you go to the website, you'll see this disclaimer come up and saying, if you're looking at tropical systems, refer to the National Hurricane Center. And they actually also have a similar mapping system, but instead of being based on the tidal levels, it's based on the hurricane categories. So category 1, 2, 3, which is great. But again, keep in mind too, that it's not just based on the hurricane categories, but where the center of the low of the hurricane actually comes up. That could cause tidal flooding. And if we have a chance, I'll bring that up too, and I'll make sure I share that link after this as well. So this is what the non-tropical tidal page would look like. This was a case from Mother's Day weekend, which this was still a test website before we had fully rolled it out. But what you can do is you can select, I want to see what a major extent of tidal flooding is. So you can click that link on, and this was actually, they also clicked on major plus 1 foot, because this site here, this tidal site here, we were forecasting major flooding. You can see here the trace. This was the official forecast, which when it gets above this line, it means major flooding. So we're forecasting major flooding. So what does that mean? Where would the extent of the water be? And this was down in Virginia, by the way. And this case was interesting because we actually got some real-time verification on it. This was a picture that was taken about 3 hours prior to high tide, that was covered in that purple area. So with that, a few caveats with both storm surge forecast, tropical and non-tropical forecasting. Few caveats that our forecasting covers. This uses a still water assumption, does not mention waves or wave setups. That isn't quite as critical in Newcastle City as it is for areas that are more exposed to the ocean where you have a lot more wave action. But that is just something to keep in mind. Even if you go just a little bit further down on the Delaware Bay where you can get some waves, that can higher waves can exacerbate tidal flooding. And this also does not account for the effects of rainfall. We'll talk more about that in just a second. Erosion. So again, not as critical for Newcastle City, but for areas that have beaches and dunes, that they kind of act as a buffer for any tidal flooding. It doesn't account for erosion that typically happens during the cold months before they have a chance to replenish those dunes, or future construction. So anytime you have construction closer to the coast, that means you have less water permeable sites, because on concrete, water obviously doesn't permeate. So that can exacerbate coastal flooding upstream from that, if you have further construction closer to the coast. So I said the effects of rainfall too, and I want to go back to that. We're talking mostly about salt water, but fresh water that's coming from the other side can have an impact. Here's an example from last year, September 1st of last year, from Reedy Point and from Philadelphia. These are two very much tidal sites. And we treat them as completely tidal. And this was September 1st of last year. Does anybody remember the remnants of Ida? Caused major flooding across portions of even up here in Newcastle County, but going further north into southeastern PA and central and northern New Jersey. A lot of rain fell. This was not a tidal flood case. We didn't really have a long duration of onshore flow. The remnant low was coming from the west. So it was very weakened by that point. We did not have that potential of onshore flow at any point. But you see here, and I apologize, I'm just now realizing that the time scale is different. So this one is September 4th, but you see here in Philadelphia on basically the night of September 1st, it got into moderate flood stage. In Reedy Point, this was the afternoon into the night of September 1st, it got into minor flood stage, almost reached moderate. What was happening there? Well, we're having all this fresh water, a wave of freshwater flooding that was coming down these waterways that has to drain out some way. And so even if the salt water wasn't really piling up, the fresh water piling up on top of it resulted in flooding, which kind of looks like tidal flooding, but was technically speaking, this was more of a freshwater impact. So that's something else to keep in mind that we don't always account for in our tidal forecasts. The models that we use to try to account for that aren't going to account for that. Now, in this case, we knew, it was the freshwater flooding. We could see it was going to happen. So we tried to bump up our forecast that we were doing, but we don't have a lot of model guidance to do that. So we were kind of just doing it based on what we thought would happen. Yeah.
And you're not adding in the effects of wind into this forecast at all?
So the wind that's piling up the water, the main surge, that is being affected. That is being accounted for. What we're talking about here is the wind that may result in higher waves. That would be the only thing that's the wave setup.
So wave action is not considered.
Wave action is not considered in this.
Interesting.
Yeah. Just because we don't have the modeling capability to at this point to incorporate that into the tidal forecast. So yeah. So any other questions?
We had a lot of water with that
With-
September 2021
Mhm.
storm here in Newcastle.
Yeah.
It was a lot.
Yeah. It was compounded by the fact that, there was a lot of water that fell here in Newcastle. But the bigger issue was that the heaviest swath of rain fell in Chester County going on up into Montgomery County. And all that water had to come down the waterways. And so that led to that it just exacerbated the flooding that was here in Newcastle County. Yeah. All right, so there's my contact info real quick, but I will share that again with you all at the end. But I want to show you where to go to see these things. So let's see if I can make this work.
Cut Putin getting this.
Sorry, that's just. All right, so if you're not familiar with the National Weather Service webpage, it's just weather.gov, not weather.com, that's the weather channel, but weather.gov is us. And when you go to this page, you'll see a map of the whole country. And by clicking in our part of the woods, you'll get to the webpage specific for my office. And to get to the non-tropical page, this is the one I'll go over first. You go over current hazards. Let's see if I can get this right here. Let's see, I changed it. Sorry, it's over, hover over forecasts. And then under that, there's one that says coastal flooding. If you click on that. And we'll zoom in here. Okay, so this is the map. I haven't laid anything over it, but if I hover over this, you can see the forecast for that we have currently for Reedy Point comes up. No tidal flooding is expected in the next 3 days, which is good. But if you want to see, okay, well, what if we're forecasting major flooding? And here's where the disclaimer comes up of please don't use this during tropical systems, which I already showed you. So what would happen if this was for major flooding? And if we zoom in.
Newcastle or New Jersey disappears.
You can see what level we can zoom in. Now, anything in purple is what could be underwater if we were to have major coastal flooding. These yellow areas here, these are what we call low-lying areas, and that just means that they wouldn't necessarily flood with just tidal flooding. However, if any water gets in there, be it from rain or somehow a channel opens up and you get water in there, then it's not going to be able to evacuate out of that area while you have major flooding.
Is that based off of a time frame? Like a 6-hour storm, a 24-hour storm?
So this isn't a,
How is that based?
this isn't a forecast. This is just based on if we were forecasting major flooding, which would be, you know, the forecast would take into consideration the duration of the onshore flow. But this is just if we were forecasting major flooding, where could the water potentially reach? So yeah, and you can play around with this. Find my cursor. You can play around with what would happen if I went up to major plus 2 feet above major. How much more would that affect it? You can see a lot more areas under the purple. Or you can go on the other extent. Say we were just forecasting minor flooding at Reedy Point. What would that look like? And for Newcastle City, I'm not looking at too much, but we still have a lot of that yellow area, the low-lying areas where if we got any water back there, it wouldn't be able to drain out.
So you're down to a street level.
Mhm.
Can I ask you a question about how this relates to the floodplain? When FEMA looks at the floodplain, are they looking at what has happened in the past or what could happen in the future based on your info here? You know what I mean? Like, so you say major flooding. So they say, well, this would be 100-year flood, a major flooding. So that's what we're going to ask. We're going to say is the.
Yeah, so I don't know how they incorporate tidal flooding into the calculations of the 100-year floodplains, But what they are doing is they'll make a calculation of the return interval of a flood, which is what we call the 100-year. You can do it for any time span. You can do it for a 500-year flood, a 50-year flood. 2-year flood generally means that's the threshold we have that we think it's going to be flooding with. What that means is that doesn't mean that you had a flood in the 100-year floodplain. Poof, I'm good for another 99 years. Unfortunately, I wish that could be it, but that's not what it means. What it means is that any given year, you have a 1% chance of seeing that level of flooding, or seeing flooding in that plain, I should say, in the case of floodplain. So FEMA calculates that 100-year based on events that we've had in the past. We keep what we call a storm data database. We includes freshwater flooding events as well as tidal flooding events. We keep that database available to anybody. And so I think they utilize that, but I'm not entirely sure how they utilize it, especially with the interface of tidal flooding and freshwater flooding.
What about storm surge? Do they take that into consideration?
That would be kind of on the interface of saltwater and freshwater. I don't know how they would use that, but tropical systems are in the storm data database that they have access to as well. So, yeah.
I have a question.
Mhm.
We have dikes in
Mhm.
sort of our city. The inundation maps, do they take barriers like that into consideration, or?
They have when they have developed this. Now, I don't know how often they're going to rework this and look at it. And, if you have any future development of levees and things like that, I don't know how often that would be updated. But in the initial development, it was taken into consideration.
So can I ask you about the yellow areas? You said they're retention areas?
We call them low-lying areas. So if water gets into them when we're having, in this case, minor flooding, then it will be hard to get out of there.
Is that going to be exacerbated by a storm surge? So for instance, like let's say you have a barrier, you've got a good barrier to protect your city, but now the storm surge goes over that. And now is the water caught in there?
Yeah, so if this is, in this case, the storm surge, this is what would be caused by the storm surge. That would be what we caused by the storm surge. Water gets in here would be like from rain or, from a freshwater creek flowing into it. And it just means that it can't drain out of there. It's not necessarily that the salt water is getting in there, but that other water is getting in there and can't get out because of the salt water up here. Real quick, I'll show you too the tropical version of this. Let's see if I can find it on the fly. So this is the National Hurricane Center webpage. And I can send you this link as well. But it will also be, if we have an active system, it will be headlined up at the top of the weather.gov. It's a part of the National Weather Service, but this is a national center that just focuses on tropical systems.
Slosh.
Slosh is something a little different. It's actually historical ones. All right, so this is the storm surge risk map. And all right, so this is tropical storm surge. So we're just focusing on tropical, not focusing on non-tropical. And you can see up at the top, that it has category 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, which relate to, we always like to emphasize this, this is this is only defined by the wind speed of the tropical system, not any of the other hazards. However, remember how I said that wind is one of the major factors in storm surge, so it does have some relation to the storm surge, but it is only describing the wind field of a system. So you can play around with this and you can see what this would be the maximum potential storm surge, or at least the reasonable worst case scenario, I should say, of storm surge with a category 1. Now, remember, I said that, it's also very dependent on how fast the storm is moving and the track that the storm takes. This doesn't take into account any of that. This is just a reasonable worst case scenario. And so you can turn on category 1, 2, takes a minute to enter, 3.
We're in Jersey. I think it's reaching your office there.
And it does not have the category 5, and the reason for that is it's very unlikely that we'd have a category 5 in our area. Generally, it's considered that a category 3 would probably be the maximum that we would see, but it has modeled for potential of a category 4. But again, this is just a reasonable worst case scenario, and this also, like the non-tropical inundation mapping, is not a forecast, but it's just something that you can play around with to look at. So
Were the previous slide website where we were talking about coastal flooding and Reedy Point, that was basically could be a real time in case of a storm. Is that correct?
So you're talking about the Reedy Point forecast?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let me zoom back out.
Did you say 6 times a day?
Twice a day.
Twice a day?
So this has been updated, this was updated, we updated by 5 a.m., 5 p.m. So this is, this forecast was created within the last 3 hours or so. And the OBS get updated every, I think, 20 minutes.
So if we had another Hurricane Sandy or even a Hurricane Ion coming up into this area, this would be the more important site to look at, I guess.
This forecasting is only for non-tropical systems. We lose a little bit of the benefit with tropical systems because it's a little bit of a different animal. So the inundation mapping and the storm surge watch and warnings that I showed you, that would be more focused on the tropical storm surge and would be telling you the reasonable worst case scenario. To be honest, I don't know quite how it works with this forecast with a tropical system, because again, thankfully, we haven't had to worry about that yet since the tropical storm surge was initiated, since we've had a major storm surge event. So yeah, to be honest, I'm not totally sure how that would all work, but in a tropical case, you should be using the stuff from the National Hurricane Center. Yeah. That's about all I had. So any other questions?
That was terrific. Thank you, Sarah. That was really interesting.
It was great, thank you.
Yeah. Everything we see makes us more scared.
Sorry, that wasn't my intention to make you all scared.
No, Thank you so much. We're gonna start discussing something else, so you're perfectly welcome to stay around, or if you wanted to be on your way. I really appreciate your time today. It's really kind of you to come. Thank you, Rick, for working that out for us. The next thing on the agenda is the continuing discussion of code changes and other actions that might affect the Newcastle flood insurance rates. Now, I sent everybody, and it's also today, you got a copy of this community rating system, you're very familiar with this, right? Jack?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was wondering if you could maybe go, just give us a sense of, I know we're category 8 right now, right?
Right.
Yeah,
That's was the fairly low hanging fruit. That was me doing 2 passes of it pretty much on my own time
right.
to lower flood insurance rates. So you'll notice that your flood insurance rates are about 10% cheaper than they would be.
I did notice that, actually.
And
Thank you.
Newcastle County is twice that good, but they have a little different ballgame because we're a little bit limited in the credits we can get. And we're also requires staff time to actually do this stuff and keep the follow-up. You notice little flood brochures that come out sometimes, at the events like Art on the Green and Day in Old Newcastle sometimes, and then sometimes we use billboards in Clear Channel. Sometimes you'll see stuff in your utility bills about flooding, and all that's part of the community rating system. And those efforts serve to get you lower flood insurance. Our flood insurance in town is finally been changed. It started last fall, and everybody else from the original scheme, which was built in 1973. And this is the first time they've changed the rating system, and where elevation certificates aren't as much of a factor now in determining flood rates. They do it through some different sorts of science and measure.
Well, is there any more low hanging fruit for us to deal with? Like, for instance, if we were to do the website and the outreach and the meetings, the meetings with the residents and everything, would that help us? Would that gain us some points?
Yes, it would, but I'm fairly insistent that you're gonna have to, pay more attention, devote more resources to getting somebody to solve that for you. It's not really difficult.
I'm not asking you to do it. Jeff.
No, but I'm saying the community's got to decide to spend tax dollars to save citizens, a portion of the citizens' flood insurance premium. And it's a trade-off. It's a political decision, and it's up to the folks that you elect to make it.
Well, last month, John Geisling, you know him from the
Very
county
well.
very well. He was talking about what the county was doing, and I know you said they're in a different situation, I get that. But he had a couple of things, and wanted to ask you, are they feasible? The month before, you had said you were the only one who voted against, saying no building in the flood zone, right? In some vote.
No, I wasn't the only one, but there were very few of us.
Yeah,
And
right.
was Senate Bill 34 or something.
Well, so John, so the county does prohibit building in the flood zone.
Sort of. Remember, we are in a riverine tidal floodplain. So it's quite possible to fill our tidal floodplain in Newcastle and not have a negative effect on anyone else. Just get
Right.
our houses up.
Right.
That's not the case in the river that roll along the rivers and creeks in Newcastle County. If you fill up those, then you're gonna have a negative effect upstream. And especially as aerial flooding keeps getting worse, the damage you've done to lower the channel, decrease the channel, has a worse and worse effect for those people upstream. We're
Right.
not at all in that situation.
I know, we discussed that last month too, and I think, the conclusion, you said that, David Athey said that, Dave Wargus said that.
Yeah,
It's
the
not gonna
state
make a
floodplain
difference.
coordinator. It's not.
But will it make a difference for the points?
Well, we could get some points, but remember that remember how frustrating it must be for me, because, it took me more than 10 years to just harass the dickens out of Newcastle County to get them even to try to be in the federal flood insurance program. They were just reluctant. They didn't want to spend the resources because there's no payback to the politicians in the tax base. What you're doing is increasing your expenditures and not increasing revenue. And that's a reasonable political decision, but You know, in town here, we have people paying flood insurance rates. From people that pay $260 a year to people that pay about $11,600 a year.
I know, that was
And-
startling. You
and
said that the
that-
other
that's-
couple months ago. I thought it
That's,
was amazing.
yeah, that's kind of something that means a lot to the folks in town that do have to pay. And you'd be surprised at how many people are in the floodplain. You've seen the latest flood study from the town where we think there may be more people at risk even than the flood map would lead you to.
Do you have any sense how far away we are from category 7? How much effort we have to put into it?
It goes to the effort of swag. How feasible is it for us to do it? I think a few months to 6 months of a person's work
To do what, though?
to decide if you're gonna get.
No, I'm saying, what would that person have to be doing in order
They
to?
would have to read the flood, manual. I've got the whole series of them, but they'd have to read the current one, which is 2018 maybe. But, you just have to read it and understand how much of that will be, that the regulators will agree, comply, is what you've stated it is. We get audited every year. I have to go through an audit every year for you guys, and then every 5 years, it's pretty much just a complete physical exam, annual physical exam every 5 years, and it's just inside and out. And they'll decide from the get-go whether you're complying with the requirements for the federal flood insurance program. I have no idea the flood insurance program is going to change on risk 2.0. The new rating, the new way that they determine the premiums, and anybody's sure what's really going to happen. So, would you be close enough? Would you like to get another 5%? Yeah, but you're not. It's not going to be. You're not going to have somebody just volunteer to do it. You're going to have.
But if you, let's say we did annually a meeting, with the residents, and we, we put together a website that was extremely informative, and, we were to be constantly, notifying people of what's happening, and, various, as Tish said, various elements of the flood situation in the paper and things like that. That wouldn't be somebody doing it, it would be us doing it, and wouldn't that help?
Well, really, they want you to do something, and certainly public awareness is a key part of the program, but it's not raising the level of your dike protection. It's not changing the infrastructure so that people are less likely to flood. The community and very few communities in Delaware, including Buchanan County, have the actual political will to just outlaw building in the floodplain. People want to be next to the water, and they're willing to take risks.
Yeah, I was gonna say, how many building sites would that actually affect? It would be quite a few here, wouldn't it? I mean, like, for instance, on the
Well, we've
Strand,
got
down from,
between 200 and 300 in the floodplain right now. So you're, and every time that the flood map changes, there'll be probably more people in the floodplain. So we try to figure out how to protect those people. Again, the efforts to directing the city into getting compliant set of levees along the river will have the greatest impact on the.
yeah.
And that's what we're talking about.
We're sort of waiting to see if we can get funding for that. So
Well,
I was
you
thinking
would-
that in the meantime,
I
maybe there's
know.
other stuff we can do.
Again, my frustration can be that you're waiting for somebody else to bail you out. And it's perfectly economically feasible for this town to do it themselves and just take advantage of every federal program we can get, a state program. But the cost of these premiums is getting to be significant. And the taxpayer, and then has a negative effect on the value of property in town and the vitality of the town. So we don't want to lose the Reed House, but we need to put some, a levee up there. If we raise the levee of the dikes 3 feet, the levees 3 feet, why we would have a very interesting situation where our flood premium, where our flood insurance ratings would probably plummet. But that takes a lot of political will to do it. People don't want to
Yeah.
look at the dike and they don't want to pay the money to raise the
Right.
dike. But that kind of money is only, it's less than $10 million for sure. And-
Well, I'm trying to go for the low hanging fruit, like
I
you
know, well,
said.
that's
I'm
been-
looking for something
that's
that we
been-
can do right
that's
now to
been
help
plugged.
people.
Get political will, get a professional to come in and work at this more than full time. There's only
To
so
work at
much
what?
that there's only so many hours in a day. And you can only do so many. One.
So can I make a point, and I don't know anything about this system other than what you sent out, but it's really minimal points for the public information piece.
I know
It's the
that.
it's the big points for, well, like flood protection, the 1,600 versus like 80.
I know, but I
So we can,
I was
I'm
trying
not
to-
sure.
But
What
look
I'm
at,
trying to do is, I want to see how close we are to the next category, number one.
No, yeah, I don't
I'd
know.
not to be harsh, but we do that every year. It's, if I thought that it was really easy to do, I'd probably muster up some more of my spare time to do it.
You're very
It's not.
discouraging.
No, no, you just
I'm
work
trying
to the
to, I'm
spot.
trying to do something positive here, you know?
Okay, do something positive, and that is get the information out to the citizens of town that you need to direct, a professional to do it. Newcastle County has many people working on their flood insurance program, even though they didn't want to do it. Now they're chided, cajoled into doing it, and they found out that it's a good thing. And they've devoted many resources to it. You should see what they do you should see what they spend in Newark, for example. It's got almost, well, it's a fraction of the floodplain we've got. But what they spend, and they're only, 3 times bigger than the city, our city. It's not, there's 15,000 real residents over there, and we're 5,000, 6,000, there's not 20,000 full-time. All students in there.
so I have a question. You've mentioned a couple of times that it seems to be just personnel issues, that's part of the
Well,
problem
it's
here.
resources, and in the city, and the mayor and council,
But it's
Yeah.
human resources
Yeah.
you're talking about.
to
Mostly.
begin with, yes, to run and manage this program, certainly.
To manage this
Resources. And the
program.
Council has a budget hearing every year, open to the public, and you could listen to what some people tell them, and they, they don't want to raise taxes any more than the other governmental body does, because they look bad, so they.
To manage this program, would a part-time person be a helper? Would it need to
Well,
be a
you get-
full-time
which
person?
What part-time person? If maybe some part-time, some part of one person in an engineering firm, a lot of more than a full-time staff member. But it's probably, I don't want to offend any of my keepers, so I will say that they make conscious, reasonable political decisions, and
Understood.
they try, but they're listening to political will of the people that they govern, and if the people they govern tell them what they want, then that's what they'll be more likely to do.
Is there a way to find out, well, you probably know this, our own points, where the points are distributed and how close we
Of
are?
course, but that would be something offline. It gets into minutia. We could spend certainly until tomorrow morning talking about just the current points we have in the federal Sierra.
Well, I'm just curious if the ones that have the most points are the ones that we've actually done the most of, for
Well,
instance,
I would-
how require
hope so.
Freeport, we do that, for instance, so.
I'm human too. I try to get the easiest, the most effective way to get a job done. You could, Tim could put a fire out by smothering it with wet blankets, but it might be a lot easier to put a snorkel up there and extinguish it. So it's the same thing for any political endeavor. You have to, you could, but the book is available online. You've got the citation for it right here. You can read what the credits are yourself. It's a pretty thick book, but you can, it's not too complicated. You can read it, and then you can try to figure out what little chunks of that might apply to the city. Now, we will never get to be, oh God, we'll never go down to 40% discount or 50% discount. We don't have the kind of opportunities based on the community rating system to get that. We can't control, we don't get credit for dam safety for one thing. Why? Because we don't have any dams up in the north. We're never gonna get that. That could be a pretty sizable chunk of change, but there's just, if you read the book, you can go through it section by section. It's each night, you could read one section of it. And, in a few weeks, you'd have it done. But you'd probably forget the first section. If you're like, yeah, you've got, no, it's really, you grew up with this. I started this in 1991 and got us in the community rating system in 93. 91 to get the application, get the first application in. I physically was ordered to do it on my own time. So yeah, so there's not so much political will to get this done, but if enough, when people realize how much the flood insurance is going up, then they're going to see, well, hey, what's the only reasonable way we're going to really lower the most premium dollars for the most taxpayers? Won't be for any one person. Some people might be left out. But if we rate, if you get compliant set of dikes, which will be, I think now 1.5 feet over base flood elevation, then you can expect to get credit for those levies for.
Well, see, this is what I was hoping for. I was thinking that while we're waiting to determine whether or not we have this help from the NRCS, if we could do something that would help to lower the cost of flood insurance, then I think we would build up a lot of political capital for what we want to do in the future. You know, public relations would be better. You know, that's what I'm hoping, to try to find some way that we can show that we're doing something. And then when we get to the point where it's going to be probably a little controversial, we'll have a little goodwill. That's what I was thinking. You know, so what I wanted to find out was, is there something that we can do that's outside of the building, the construction right now, that would help get us to, let's say, another 5% off by getting to category 7. See, this was my strategy.
And if you read the book, you could come up with a strategy to get there. You might want to spend a bit more money on the building department to get a bigger staff for the building department. We've only cut staff for the building department since I've been here, and so that it's pretty difficult to do. If you farm it out to the building in which be meeting with them tomorrow, if you farm it out to an engineering firm, do, for example, building inspection, now you're gonna pay a lot more probably for building inspection, but you're gonna get some more points for the community rating system. It doesn't matter so much. Our codes naturally evolve. The code is hugely different than it was when I got here. You know, all the big storms in Florida happened. The building code has been more wind and storm driven than it was more just fire driven. When I came here, the building code was 10% gravity and 90% a fire code, and then a little bit of storm built in, you know, a little bit of weather stuff built in. Now it's entirely different, and the more effort that you spend to try to be logical, and I don't know, when I was fighting fires when I was a kid, it was really exciting because we had fires all over the place, and now through a lot of changing code and a little bit of education in schools, I think is a huge thing. We don't have the house fires, the structure fires we used to have. So things keep getting better, but it's not easy. There's not, I mean, not to be impertinent. Don't you think I'd try that?
Yeah,
Every-
I want you, I hear you, and I'm not gonna sit here and tell you that I understand everything that you said, you know, bits and pieces within. But like the city part, the end that I live in, the majority of those people, I'm sure, don't have flood insurance. Now, I'm one of them that I do not have flood insurance. So I guess my question is because it seems like the historical part of Old Newcastle is so much more aware of the things that you're saying, and I'm going to say, and I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, that the majority of that end, you know, they have flood insurance because of the area that they're around. But my end, we don't. I mean, this is all new. I know about flood insurance, and this is all new to me in a sense of what you're saying. And this is why, you know, I've invited my two neighbors and plus other neighbors to get them involved so we can understand what is needed and what our part, you know, is needed in this so that we can all benefit from, as they say, not if, but when it'll happen. It's not an if, but a when.
Right.
And I got more involved. I think I was telling Alex, I got really involved. What happened is, as you were saying, there, when Hurricane Ida hit, my church went under. We're still fighting with FEMA. I'm the head of the trustee board at my church. So we're still fighting with FEMA to try to get some money. And luckily, a business owner was kind enough to solicit and fundraise and got us a large amount of money to get the mold remediation done before anyone could go down and do anything, which I'm sure you're very aware of that. So that's what brought me. And then as I was talking to the Couches, they had to have insurance, flood insurance when they moved. I moved several, 5, 6, 7 years later in that area, and flood insurance was never mentioned to me. I mean, I'm just, all of this is new, and this is why I wanted to be involved so I could understand as much of it as I could from the standpoints that you're giving me. Historical Newcastle, you know, you've been involved in this so long, you really know the ins and outs. I'm just getting a little bit of the end from just, you know, just now participating since what, a couple months ago, I think about 2 or 3 months ago.
Yeah.
And you know how I saw it? I happened to see in the, what's the letter that
Weekly?
comes, the weekly that comes out. And that's how I started coming, got involved. And then I shared with my neighbors and they chose to come so that we can make the city part of Old Newcastle aware, just as aware as the historical part is. So that's where I'm,
Public awareness is a really important.
yeah, that's where I'm torn.
I can tell you that the north end of town, it relatively has increased their level of flood protection to a much greater extent than the middle or the south end of town has. It's just over the last third of a century. It's just happenstance, but that's what's happened. So the north end of town is relatively, compared to 30 years ago, 30 plus years ago, you're much more improved than the rest of town. So one of the things that astounds me is that probably the most valuable string of houses in town just resists flood protection. So
Guess what?
Resists flood protection because they don't want to lose river views or something. So we are, the public awareness and a decision-making consensus for the citizens is what's really important. I just can't offer you any more than you. I'm so happy to see this committee here now. I'm hoping that it's going to be a permanent committee that will just keep addressing this issue and pushing the politicians into thinking about what we have to do as the world changes. Certainly, we can certainly get another 100 years out of this town, in the worst case scenario, if we just do a little bit of
They'll never know, will we?
No.
work. I'm afraid not.
Individually.
So, I mean, looking at some of the points, the whole mapping and regulation, as we look at potential code changes, we could get some points for,
Well, that's what I
Well,
wondered,
we-
you know, we'd have to
we-
see what our points are right now, how many more.
Because
Yeah,
we do
in that
have,
particular-
we adopt, we follow the model state floodplain ordinance, so we get those points on a statewide basis. We keep our building code, and now as that's becoming more and more important, we're just as, our code's exactly the same as what Newcastle County's is. We're up to the 2018 edition, probably headed for the 2021 edition, so we're increasing our, we're up there, we're getting the points that we should
Hey
get.
Jeff, will we get some points for that study that's being done right now?
It would be very difficult to tell you. What that'll do is tell us where we have to concentrate our efforts. I mean, it's a little, you're welcome to go over that report whenever you want, but it's interesting to notice how many properties are at risk and some of the ones we thought might be aren't, so.
is it finished study,
Almost.
or is it in a form?
It's,
to-
no, it's
not-
the data, the big spreadsheet, I think, is finished very recently. And they'll have to turn into a product that people can use.
Is
Pretty
flood-
much maps.
Floodplain mapping is one of the things that's listed here. Would that be what you're talking about? Would that be that study would be floodplain mapping?
And we have mapped our floodplain. I mean, our floodplain's pretty clear. There's no, the big credit for that one is if you've got A zones instead of AE zones. If you've got areas of flooding, but they're not absolute elevation hasn't been scientifically determined, we keep tweaking our transects so that we can understand where the real flood, what the levels really are for base flood elevation. But we know every inch of the city, what base flood is, so it's not. Get big credit there too.
Now, can I ask Alex, the points that you are referring to, does that decrease the,
More points you get, the lower you can raise your rating, and if the lower your rating, everybody starts out as 10, and then you can work your way down to, I don't know what, somebody's already got.
So it can improve.
So it doesn't
it can
increase-
Decrease your
points you
flood.
get,
okay, that's
The
what,
more
that's,
discount you get
Yeah,
on your
okay.
flood
all right,
insurance.
okay. That's
So
my
every step is 5%.
right.
You know, it's not insignificant for a lot of people,
No.
really.
I heard you keep emphasizing on the points, so I
Yeah.
was wondering.
Well,
if
yeah, this
that's
is the
what
list
you-
of, see, these are the categories and the number of points you can possibly get and the average points that people get. So I was hoping maybe to, get some points to get us up to
Yeah.
the next category. So that we can, have accomplished something for the people here already. Because it's gonna be, even if we do changes in the, levies, whatever, it's gonna be years. Because it's it's gonna take a long time to engineer it and then to construct it if we do that, actually.
So we gotta keep insurance.
Yeah, so I was just trying to do something, right now to help people out a little bit. So I was hoping that.
But
maybe
some
we
of
could-
this stuff would take quite a while too, to do. Some of
Yes.
it would take quite a while to do.
Right, but
So
probably not
it's-
years, like, if we were to,
And there's no guarantee of how many points you'll get, the
Well, that's-
maximum point, but then look at the average points.
I know, that's why I'd like to find out how many points we have now and see how many we need to get to the next category. Do you have a sense of that, Jeff? Do you have any idea how many?
If I thought it was anywhere near low hanging, we'd be there. But it's not not theoretically impossible. I think we could match the county for sure, but I don't know how much farther than we could go.
I'm sorry, I can't hear what you're saying.
We could probably, with enough effort, we might be reasonably hopeful to expect that we might possibly get That's category 6.
Oh, see, that's what I'm hoping for. That's what I
Well, there's a
like.
lot of disclaimers.
Yeah, I got that, possibly,
And
maybe.
you want to help,
In
if
the-
you read that book and we'll talk about
Yeah, okay.
In the report, you have to do something every year. Would it be, is there a report
it. I have
that,
to continue to,
but where you can see like what we're doing?
yes, I
Sort
can
of.
explain that to you.
Well,
offline.
I mean,
Like I said, it'll take the rest of the night to talk about what. we've done.
Do you have that book? If I go to your office, can I borrow it? Or do I have to buy?
It's
read
down
it
online.
or-
You can just read it online if you'd like.
Okay,
It's right, you've given the URL right there in your little handout.
yeah, probably it does, yeah.
And I can show you what our credits are right tomorrow. I can email you the credits for what we get now for, but anybody that wants to can come in while we have the meeting, at least the 5-year meeting with the, you know, for the program. But if whoever's doing the audit will consent to, you know,
So
allowing it.
I have one question on this. Read the book, then committee decide what is necessary, what is important for the residents to go by their needs.
Right,
So, you know, we have to go by somebody's needs.
right, yeah.
So as a board, it would seem to me that if we read the book that he suggests, decide what would be feasible for everyone to follow to be able to any point at this book. Because you said it's gonna take years, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, so, yeah, I'm just, if there's something in there that it would be feasible for the committee, you know, for the task force to do, to
But-
raise our rate, that would be excellent, and I'm
But
hoping.
you heard him say, if it was feasible to do, he would have done it, right?
It was either
So that's
easier
not
or
feasible
felt
to
good.
do.
I didn't say
So
that
the-
already.
So I think, yeah,
But-
the
Oh,
biggest,
I didn't.
so the biggest.
But
thing
I'm
is
also
just-
hearing
is
that
time.
guess
him
everybody
by
needs
himself
stuff to
can't
eat.
do it.
But
Well, he can't, he doesn't have the time in the event
there's
calendar.
plenty of things. I've been back on the road even Wednesday. I got tomorrow off. But how about this is a reaction to what sea level rise, you know, and flooding does to the city. And the sea level rise committee, short-lived as it is to try to come up with strategies to combat the sea level rise itself, not the insurance that results from it. And I'm thinking, trying to kick you in the pants and say, let's try to come up with a solution for the sea level rise the best we can. I know you did great getting the.
We are doing that. The
Yeah.
thing is, right now, we're treading water because we're waiting. And so I was looking for something that we could do in the interim.
Well, I
Okay.
think one thing we could do is the things that we said we were gonna do 2 months ago, you know.
Right,
maybe we
and I
need
think
to
all of those
start
things are
working on
pretty
that
much
stuff.
listed here
Yeah,
as possibilities of getting a few points.
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
No, you're good. I was just gonna say, when Gail and I meet with Jeff, we can talk about what is it that, we can do, like where our number is now, what is it that we can do? And then we can bring it back to figure out what's gonna be, time is one thing, you know, it takes time, and what would be kind of like the least resistance to get us closer. So I think we can, once Gail and I meet with Jeff, we can hopefully, I would say, bring back some more information to help steer like what direction that we could,
yeah, I agree.
would be best.
I think one thing I remembered from what Mr. Geisler said last month, that really stuck with me, especially because of the discussion of, you know, the building on Luton's Drive and that. The non-rise course, he said we have a non-rise code, which says you cannot construct anything that is gonna make the water rise around you. You know, so you can't displace enough so that the water will rise. And that seems to me to be a cool thing, you know?
It is. In fact, it's the state law, so every community says.
Is it? So it's
Then they
nothing
had to
new?
do that, they did.
Oh,
And besides that, the project in Riverbridge is just not in the floodplain. not
Yes, I
only
know.
isn't it
I
gonna
know.
make it rise, but you could fill that one up to the moon and you wouldn't even notice it at all. Now, if the sea level comes up enough, comes up another, what, I think that'll be about 5 feet about, and then that one would be, you know, in the floodplain, and then that.
We'd
would
have to come up 5 feet though, not a foot and a half like they're saying for 2050. So it won't
think
come up
that's
that high
awfully
according to
optimistic.
FEMA for another 70 years.
Right. But the, we have to live in today's world a little bit, because that's what the economic drivers. But we can plan for, you cannot build in the floodplain now, if you want to say you can't build in a floodplain that we guess might be here in 50 years. That's the thing. So that project will be, we're assuming that that project, and I'm not for or against it, but that project would be okay for over 50 years. And then that would, be the estimated lifespan of a light frame building that we build now, you know, between 50 and 100 years at the outside. We don't have the materials that we had when Old Newcastle was built, so we didn't want to get, weren't going to get the life out of the buildings that we used to get. But a 50-year life expectancies, or you know, a 30-year mortgage, a 50-year life expectancy for a building, and if you're still out of the floodplain, then if you can still function at that place, that's kind of a reasonable guess. To try and guess if you don't want anybody to build where floodwater might come up in 100 years, that's, you know, that's
It's a harder
pretty
sell.
theoretical, and nobody can do anything with their land, and they won't stand for that. You know, it's just, how could you like to own a beautiful bit of land and not be able to do it?
Yeah. That's what worries me too, that people thinking about that as being a taking of their property, you know, the value of their property. If you change the rules and they already own the property and thinking about it as a, you know, a construction site,
But
they haven't planned anything
Right,
yet, but
in our town, there is just, even a conservative engineer will say the floodplain's 150 square miles. And it's titled, no matter if we filled every bit of our floodplain in Newcastle, you couldn't measure, there's no scientific instrument built that could measure the difference in that water. You just won't, because it'll just flow back in the ocean. So and this is entirely different than Newcastle, the vast majority of Newcastle.
well, I'd like to read that book. And I'd like to
You've got
see
the
it.
URL right here. You can start
going
it
to-
tonight.
I'm going to
You can
read it.
Go home instead of watching
maybe-
game shows on television, you can
And
watch
how-
that bad boy.
How do I get where we are right now? How do I find out our points? And
I'll
then just-
mail them to you.
Oh,
I'll email
great.
you
Thanks,
this.
Jeff.
Of
I
course,
appreciate
it's
that.
not a secret.
Okay, all right.
I can-
Okay, cool.
If I work hard enough, I can email it to you for every year since '93.
Please
Oh,
don't. give me
my.
that.
Oh,
Please
my
don't.
goodness.
We've got to
Just
live
the
in it
latest,
now.
just
We've
the
got to live
latest.
in what we got right now.
Yeah,
that
we
would
got
be
it
good, that would
right
be good.
now.
Okay, does anybody else have anything else to add or you want to comment? Should we all leave before Tish gets back or what?
You're just mean.
Anyway,
Glad you're a big one.
okay, well, if that's it. I guess we are adjourned. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Jeff, for being here. Really appreciate it. I asked Jeff about that. Jeff, did you get an email this afternoon about the pond with the algae?
Yes, I did actually talk to the conservation district about it.